I'm John Lyne. I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Communication. I also teach in the MA program in bioethics at the University of Pittsburgh.
And can you talk about what drew you into the rhetoric of science?
Well, I'd never been a student of science really until I got philosophically interested in it. And I had done my doctoral dissertation on the American pragmatist and scientist Charles Sanders Peirce, whose semiotics were of interest to me, but he had this very programmatic and expansive view of science, and among other things called for a rhetoric of science, what he called a speculative rhetoric, by which one idea would produce another. And given that he was such a serious and systematic philosopher, it was very interesting to me that he was interested in rhetoric. And so that sort of was the philosophical background for me. But the thing that really drew me into writing about it, about science in the contemporary environment, was that in the 1980s, there was a rising field called sociobiology, named by E.O. Wilson. And it had really taken off. Wilson had written this large textbook about sociobiology that was mainly about other animals, but he had a final chapter that was about humans. And it purported to talk about the biological bases of social behavior. And then he wrote a very widely circulated popular book called On Human Nature. Sociobiology then got legs and started influencing a lot of different fields, because in the humanities and in the social sciences, people are always looking for more powerful explanations for the phenomena that they're examining. And I was noticing that in journals coming from sociology, political science, and elsewhere, people were now using sociobiological accounts of things that were happening in our political culture, explaining Supreme Court decisions on the basis of alleged genetic strategies. And this was rather surprising to me. And as a rhetorician, I recognize this as what you would call a naturalizing strategy, where you take human culture and explain it as just a manifestation of nature. And historically, the track record for that view has been not entirely a happy one. And so I wanted to see what I could find out about it. And did some work on the area, and then was luckily introduced to a biologist who was working at the University of Iowa at the time, Henry Howe. And he was also interested in this issue, and he had been educated into this whole population genetic and evolutionary biology model that was sort of being springboarded off of by Wilson and others. And we did some co-authoring about it, and we did an investigation of the history of the terminology of genetics over the 20th century. And we wrote a long monograph in social epistemology on gene talk, as we called it. Gene talk being the sort of loose usage of genetic terminology, which has the capacity to sort of migrate from its specifically contextualized and controlled scientific contexts into other environments. And what we tried to show was that even within that whole complex of specialized study areas that is evolutionary biology, the notion of genes, the notion of fitness, the notion of heritability, things like this were moving on the legs of words. And as they migrated into one area after another, they would somewhat change their meaning. So if that happens within the sciences, what happens when it migrates beyond the sciences and gets into popular culture, gets into the social sciences, gets into the humanities? And so that's what got me interested in that area of study.
So 20 years ago, the Association for the Rhetoric of Science and Technology, then of course the American Association for the Rhetoric of Science, was founded, and I believe you were there. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of what led up to the founding? What was the exigence that led you and some of the others to want to found an organization? What was the kind of thinking? What were your hopes for the organization?
Well, I suppose it was divine inspiration, But the more pedestrian explanation was that I had for a few years been gathering a group of interested scholars together at the NCA conferences for what I called the Rhetoric of Science Visibility Project, and the acronym being RSVP. We would have breakfast. Alan Gross, Bill Keith, Tom Lessel, some of the people who were involved. And this went on for several years, and then Henry Cripps arrived at the University of Pittsburgh with a science interest and with a strong rhetoric program undergirding him. He called me at the University of Iowa and said we should start an organization, sort of a Pittsburgh, Iowa collaboration initially. And so at the next NCA, we had a constitutional meeting and constituted ourselves out of thin air. And among those there were some very colorful Pittsburgh characters, including J.E. Ted McGuire, who is very famous for his role in the history and philosophy of science, and then being one of the founders of that distinguished department at Pittsburgh. But Carolyn Miller was there, and a number of people, and so we weren't sure where it was going to go, but fairly quickly, NCA allowed us to propose and mount panels, and we started doing that, and so it sort of grew from there. And then in fairly short order, we started doing pre-conferences, which became a regular thing, and so that's the beginning. And it's hard to believe it's been 20 years. I don't know if we anticipated that kind of longevity, but based on this most recent pre-conference, I would say it's destined for a much longer run. It seemed a very healthy discussion, and the sense of vitality I got was very much reinforced by the experience of Tuesday. Plus, one sees lots and lots of articles now about rhetoric of science. I mean, it's showing up with increasing frequency in the journals concerning rhetoric and technical communication, in some cases argumentation. And so it looks like it's something that's just, going to continue to grow. And it's quite understandable that it would. It's not just because of our efforts. It's because this is a society that is dependent on science, highly dependent on technology, but has a very complex and I would say ambiguous relationship to its science. Its culture and its science are in a kind of complicated arrangement. And so for rhetoricians, this seems worth studying.
Could you say a bit more about the sociology of the rhetoric of science? A number of people have underlined the role that Pitt played early on, and you mentioned the Pitt, Iowa connection with Poroy, of course, and you had quite literally a foot in both of those communities. And then also there's the HPS program in Pitt. So could you say a little more about that?
Well, I left Iowa in 1996 and went to Pittsburgh. At Iowa, we had a project called the Project on Rhetoric of Inquiry, Poroy, and you've talked to David Depew already, I believe. And that was, in some ways, a rhetoric of science project. The term inquiry designates something a bit broader than just science proper. But, some of the rhetoric of science sociology, I think, starts there and throughout the 80s. And the book series that we edited and the conferences we had coming out of Iowa, I think were what made it thinkable that we could do something like this. And when I got to Pittsburgh, there were grad students there. And interestingly enough, there were people, philosophers and historians and philosophers of science who were talking about rhetoric. And this was quite unusual. This is their philosophy department and their history and philosophy of science department are world-class, among the best in the world in both instances. And you had people who were interested in rhetoric, and they had a conference in 1992 on Rhetoric, Rationality, and Science, and a volume was published out of that, edited by Henry Cripps and J.E. McGuire. And it was a collection of essays that included people from several different fields. Now, there were several Pittsburgh people who stayed active in it, and over the years, the sociology was sort of, unpredictable from one year to the next, because, we would need somebody each year to plan the next pre-conference, which meant they had to assume the role of vice president of the organization. And, sometimes you had to beat the bushes a little bit to get somebody who was willing to do it. And we've had good luck, I would say. This year Lisa Kiernan was willing and able to do it and did a marvelous job with the bicentennial conference. But, there wasn't a lot of machinery associated with it. It was loosely connected to NCA. The pre-conference has sometimes migrated to other venues as well, such as the Rhetoric Society of America. And so it's showing a little bit of independence from its original ecological niche.
Can you say a little more? You indicated there was a lot of overlap. McGuire, you and McGuire taught a course in science and its rhetorics at Pitt for many years until he retired. And so at Pitt, there's been a certain kind of charitable interpretation of rhetoric. But in the broader field, there's seems to be kind of still a lingering tension between the rhetoric of science and the philosophy of science and the history of science. Could you say a little more about what's at stake there, and what those fields think about rhetoric of science and what rhetoric of science thinks about those fields?
Well, there's been a good bit of change in those various constellations. You had a period of analytic philosophy where the epistemological rigor was such that rhetoric was just not welcome at all. But when you cast these things in more historical terms, as the history and philosophy of science philosophers did, you had to take account of the kinds of arguments that were going on within cultural contexts. And so there was a kind of opening to the term rhetoric. An associated term that is often sort of an index of the state of the relations between those groups is the word argument. Now, I teach argument, you teach argument, and people in our field have throughout the 20th century and now, up till now, taught argument. And we mean it as a sort of audience-directed process that engages in premises that are not just given, as a P or a Q may be given in logic, but that have to be secured and sometimes defended. And so when philosophers talk about argument, they usually mean something almost rigorously controlled by logic alone. So epistemologically, there's been sort of that tension. The rhetoricians are more attuned to the question of who's making the judgment, who's making the assertion, where's the argument coming from, rather than just what is it in isolation as a form. And so that has been in some ways a tension ever since Plato sort of lambasted the sophists as being a little bit too loose and not concerned sufficiently with truth. And so that trope of being for truth as against effectiveness is sort of still with us, and it's an oversimplification. But given the sort of discursive turn, discursive social turn, I would say, in the study of science that has cut across several fields in recent decades, sociology included, science and technology studies, some areas of philosophy, and rhetoric of science. That kind of binary doesn't do much good. Now people are arguing about the different kinds of formations in which arguments occur and the different kinds of clashes and consistencies that may emerge from what happens within the public sphere as science enters it. I mentioned at the pre-conference that I spent a good bit of time evangelizing with philosophers of science, trying to get them to see this more rhetorical view of things. And there's a group of visiting fellows at the Center for Philosophy of Science at Pittsburgh. There's a different batch of them every year, and they're from all over the world, and they're very bright people. And there were several of them this year who have been asking me about rhetoric. They're interested in the rhetoric of science, and this is very surprising to me. And there are two of them from Germany, and they want to know about rhetoric, and I'm glad to oblige.
So ARST has had a number of memorable moments over the years at pre-conferences and other meetings. Are there a couple of memorable moments that you recall that you want to share your version of events?
Is this a setup? Well, I don't know. There have been a lot of very different things that happened. I remember we had a very memorable debate about climate science and global warming. Gordon Mitchell put together this wonderful debate between James Hansen, who had been the first person really in government to sort of ringing the alarm bell about global warming, and a guy named Michaels from University of Virginia, who was a climate scientist who went around casting skepticism about the whole thing, and who perhaps not coincidentally took money from Exxon. But they never debated each other. And so they were each going out and doing their monological arguments, preaching to their respective choirs. And here they were having to interact. And to me, there was a revelatory moment because each one kept kind of loosening a little bit on what the differences between them were. And I was in the audience, and I asked at one point, I said, I'm getting a difference of attitude here. I'm not getting a difference on any particular factual claims. Can you tell me what factual issues you disagree about? And I don't recall that I got a satisfactory answer at all. And this, to me, says a lot. And if you take it more generally to the public orbit and ask, what somebody thinks about climate change, the answer will depend less on how much they've studied the issue and more on what their political affiliation is. If you want to know where somebody stands on the global warming climate change issue, ask them their political affiliation. Now, this tells me that this is not just about science. It's cultural and ideological. And I saw that even in these two men of science who were passionate about their beliefs, but found themselves agreeing on more and more things and unable to disagree on things once they were in face-to-face. But Gordon Mitchell also got that transcribed and published in the Journal of Social Epistemology with a series of essays analyzing it. That was a very memorable moment. We had a very memorable discussion of intelligent design and evolution, which was very controversial, lively, but intelligent design is one of those things that whatever you think of it from a scientific viewpoint, it's very important culturally. In Pennsylvania, we had the Dover case where the school board, was requiring that in biology classes, this alternative to evolution be at least briefly discussed, intelligent design, and this got taken to court. And in the course of it, a lot of philosophers and people of academic standing came in to testify. And so it created this wonderful archive about what is the nature of science vis-a-vis religion or any other belief system. Steve Fuller, who is someone known to the members of this organization because he was the founder of the journal Social Epistemology and was trained in the History and Philosophy of Science department with Ted McGuire as his advisor, and then got interested in rhetoric and wrote a good bit about both of those. He testified at the trial, and to the surprise of many, he was sort of testifying that the school board should be allowed to make this kind of requirement because there's too much closure in the paradigms, that the attempt to sort of shut off investigation was unproductive, which was pretty much the view that John Angus Campbell had taken during this period, this teach the argument view of intelligent design. So this was very much in the air and real, and we talked about it in our seminar the last time Ted and I taught that seminar. We went through the Dover case and the wonderful wealth of documents there. As it turned out, after all that philosophical testimony, the decision had nothing to do with that, because the entire premise of the defense had been that this was not religiously motivated, that this was just a matter of being open-minded and not religiously motivated. But they had tapes of members of the school boards just explicitly saying, you know, we owe this to the man who died on the cross 2,000 years ago. And that pretty much gave it away, that of course this was religiously motivated. Now that's not to say there was no merit to their side of the argument, but that was what was at issue in the court. So you see, these things have a scientific dimension. People well trained in science can disagree, and it's not always clear the basis on which they're disagreeing, because they are people too, and they have political, ideological dimensions to their thought. But that debate was also memorable.
Looking back, what are the sort of persistent tensions or key intellectual sticking points that you would identify?
I think there is a lot of commonality in the concerns that people have, but there are some differences in emphasis. For example, at this conference, and this has recurrently been discussed, some are more concerned about what difference we might make in the practice of various sciences. If we're doing all this study and analysis, shouldn't it make a difference, perhaps? And it's been very hard to get impact in that sense. And it depends partly on what you're studying. If you're studying evolutionary biology, you probably shouldn't expect that, you know, the introduction of rhetoric is going to much change the science. Although one of my most exciting moments intellectually was when Richard Dawkins, the public intellectual that most of us are quite familiar with, and who introduced the idea of the selfish gene as well as the idea of the meme. This idea of a selfish gene was one of the things that was in the air when Henry Howe and I were writing. And we argued that the idea of a selfish gene was a rhetorical construction. And we didn't mean an insult by that necessarily. We meant that if you look at the way he set this up, it was a way of taking things to the level of the gene to make that the center of action. In Burkean terms, the gene becomes the actor. And our argument was that once you take away the sort of move of personification and the metaphorics of action that you sort of metaphorically attribute to the gene, that there's no change in the science at all. And we sent this to Richard Dawkins. We never heard back from him, but about 2 years later, I don't know if there was any connection, but there was a volume in which John Brockman interviewed some scientists and asked them, very famous scientists, asked them what their greatest contribution to science was, and asked Dawkins. And Dawkins said, well, my biggest contribution was that I created the rhetoric of the selfish gene. And then went on to use the word rhetoric over and over again, not running from it, but embracing it. And not only embracing it, but talking about how important rhetorical developments were to scientific conceptualization. And I just thought this was an incredible moment to see a scientist not only not running from the word rhetoric, but embracing it and saying it was his greatest contribution. So we felt a little bit of a moral victory there, because that's kind of what we'd been saying. Now you can argue about whether the rhetoric is good or bad, inimical or beneficent or whatever, But simply saying it's rhetoric doesn't mean necessarily that that's a good thing or a bad thing. As we know, rhetoric cuts both ways. And that's one of the things that the tradition lives with. Philosophers generally want to figure out what is true and right and good and so forth. Rhetoricians care about this too, but they know that the arguments can play either side in almost any context. And the knife that's used by the surgeon is also a murder weapon in the hand of someone else. And tyrants have used rhetoric to enslave people, but it's been used to liberate people. And so we don't assume that rhetoric is always on the side of the angels, but it would be sort of naive to think that any kind of intellectual enterprise was always on the side of angels. In fact, the ones that are most sort of dogmatically adhered to are often the ones that are most dangerous. Those that think they have a grip on the true, the right, and the good, and are not to be dissuaded in any way, are often the ones who enact brutal, repressive programs. And sometimes rhetoric is one of the ways of sort of loosening those bonds.
I feel compelled to ask you about the Gonkar affair. And
that was a Bond movie. I saw that. Yes. Trying to remember it.
The supervillain was amazing.
Yeah, right.
But I want to ask you something slightly different than what we've asked. Well, it's come up in other interviews. It seems to me like, in some ways, I mean, ARST preceded the Gonkar affair, though probably not his work on that particular argument. But it seems to me like that article kind of crystallized the field in a way that that it hadn't quite come together. Would you agree with that, or could you situate sort of the significance of the Gonkar?
It's paradoxical because it was a critique, and so to the extent that it crystallized it as a focus of critique, which impelled people to come back and counter-argue. So in that sense, but look, the history of that is that first of all, Dilip Gonkar was a Pittsburgh PhD who'd worked with Trevor Melia, who was one of the first people in the field who talked about rhetoric of science. And we don't want to overlook Trevor Melia's legacy in all of this, even though he hasn't been active in the field. He's been retired for a good while. But Dilip Gonkar wrote this piece in the context of one of the pre-convention seminars that Alan Gross and I put together in the 90s, I forgot which year, and to talk about rhetoric of science. And Dilip wrote this piece, and it was about the idea of rhetoric in the rhetoric of science. And to his everlasting credit, Bill Keith saw the real potential of this essay, and he and Dilip sort of began trading ideas, and Dilip revised it and went around doing it as a lecture. He came to Iowa and presented it to the Pori group with a very mixed reaction. That's an interesting story too. Deirdre McCluskey was not pleased with what seemed to be a case of somebody coming onto the ground of a place that had revered the study of rhetoric of science and trashing it. But look, the idea of rhetoric in the rhetoric of science was making the point that whatever you want to say about science, we need to have a conversation about what is meant by rhetoric when we talk about the rhetoric of science. And then he proceeded to point out two doctrinal features or ideological features that he saw in the way rhetoric, generally in the field, not just in the rhetoric of science, was conceived. And this had to do with the ideology of agency. And so it was part of a kind of post-structuralist trend, I think, to sort of say, you don't have subjects, you don't have agency, you just have articulation. And that's become sort of, familiar talk. And it's entered into conversation with Burkean lines of analysis, where agency, of course, is very important. But it did crystallize a lot of conversation. Now, there's some of us who think that we just talked about it too much because it sort of put people on the defensive in ways they didn't need to be. And so someone said at the conference, Dilip Gankar's name didn't come up once, which is kind of refreshing. I'm a big fan of Dilip Gankar. He's one of the great intellectuals of the field. But, I mean, this thing had become a little bit overdrawn. And insofar as it is a critique, it's a critique of rhetoric broadly and of a lot of the way the humanities think about human action. We've got to think about those moments when something can make a difference. Just for example, you know, for many years, McDonald's and other food chains had been putting this very strange product in its hamburgers that had a pinkish color. Nobody noticed it until somebody dubbed it pink slime, which was a brilliant rhetorical move. And it was a short time before McDonald's was no longer using it. It had nothing to do with the scientific analysis of what this was or its health effects. It was the utter disgust occasioned by the term pink slime, which, you know, juxtaposes two things that don't usually go together. And it's so somehow disconcerting for people to hear this and to think that they were eating it was just too much. And it's the triumph of a kind of rhetorical twist. And so I believe that the introduction of new metaphors and configurations, new names, can be extremely important. David Depew and I have been doing some work. We did a collaborative paper for this recent pre-conference where we talked about the way terms like Darwinism and Lamarckism have played a role up to this day and very actively right now in the interface between molecular biology and population genetics. And there's a sort of sense in which these are authorizing terms that people want to proceed under the sign of Darwin, say, or under the sign of anti-Darwin or something of that sort. So I'll give you one more example if you want one. In the 1950s, when the structure of DNA was being decoded and understood, it appeared that the coding part of the DNA was just a small part of the overall material, and the rest, it was not clear what its function was. There was a lot of stuff being carried along genetically from one generation to the next, and it didn't seem to have any function. And it was called junk DNA, which suggests that, well, it has no function, it's just baggage left over from genetic experiments and whatever. I don't mean laboratory experiments, I mean nature's experiments. And only very recently in September, there was a big splash made by a series of papers that were written for Nature magazine under the sponsorship of a group called ENCODE, a group that was using the products of the Human Genome Project to do further work. And what they had announced that made a big splash in scientific circles was that the DNA, well, let me put it this way. Molecular biologists had known for some time that a lot of what was called junk was in fact regulatory DNA. Well, what this group of papers seemed to show was that they said 70, perhaps 80, perhaps more % of that junk is in fact regulatory DNA. And this sent shockwaves across the terrain of a lot of the biological sciences. It reanimated the argument about creationism because some of the creationists sort of cheered this on and saying, well, you see, God doesn't put junk in our DNA. God puts, you know, the mechanisms for rational control in some sense. But see, that's being worked out. But the term junk had its own history. Now, there are those who are trying to kind of slow down the elimination of the use of that term because it does seem to suggest something that people want to preserve, and that is there are things that are a part of the evolutionary lineage that are not functioning. But as someone said, and I like this a lot, there's a difference between junk and garbage. Garbage is something you can and do throw away. Junk is something you keep around in case you need it. And evolution works kind of like that. Evolution is very opportunistic. It makes use of what's there. And sometimes something that's there for no apparent reason and is serving no useful function can be built on for certain kinds of adaptive purposes. And so the debate centers around terms like junk. Now, I say these are important kinds of rhetorical loci for discussion. And it's part of my more general thinking that the way we invent language and the way we construct arguments and the way we intervene is what is important about rhetoric. And Larry Prelli, whom I think you interviewed, had a wonderful definition of rhetoric in his paper for the pre-conference. He says, rhetoric studies the selectivity of enacted perspectives in particular contexts. And I thought that was right on the head. It was the idea of selectivity, of enactment of perspectives. This is very Burkean in tone, I think, in particular situations. And people are drawn to rhetoric because they know how the selectivity of enactment of perspectives can make a difference. And so the dispatch of subjects who act, I think, has always been a little bit against the grain of those who are attracted to rhetoric. But I don't want to start a quarrel with my post-structuralist friends. When people tell me there is no speaking subjects, I say, okay, fine, continue. And they never get the joke.
So you talked a bit about this, and I'd welcome you to elaborate on it a little more if you'd like to. What does rhetoric add to the study of science, technology, and medicine? But I'm also interested in the question of what does science add to the study of rhetoric? Mm-hmm. Being mindful of one of the calls yesterday to think about what rhetoric of science adds to rhetorical theory more broadly.
Well, let me see. Let me first take the question about what science may add to rhetoric. Throughout its history, there have been attempts to put rhetoric on something like a scientific basis. In the 18th century, George Campbell wrote a philosophy of rhetoric that was going to wed it to the new empirical sciences, and that would connect it with the project of science. From about the 1970s through the 80s and 90s, there were various attempts to turn rhetoric into a social science, in part because the social sciences were taking over a lot of communication departments, and it was a better defensive position to be able to say you have scientific grounding. But then something else has happened in the last 10 or 15 years, and that is that people are turning to cognitive science and to neuroscience to look for grounding for rhetoric. And this is one of the controversial, I think, points of tension. Randy Allen Harris has been very prominent in advocating the view that we need to look not just at the rhetoric of science, but at the science of rhetoric, and that science would be centered in an understanding of how the brain works. Now, as far as what rhetoric of science offers to rhetoric generally, I think it's not just a self-contained ghetto, if you will. It's not an isolated compartment, because it's dealing with the things that rhetoric's always dealt with, and it's just taking account of the characteristics of our contemporary world. Rhetoric has always had to be where the power is. When the church was the power, you taught people how to give effective sermons. When kings and potentates had the power, rhetoric was about trying to win the approval of those who had power, and so on when there are legislatures. Well, now we have science that has a huge impact in our culture and society. And so, of course, it's going to be necessary to see how that operates. Aristotle said that rhetoric deals with the available means of persuasion. And what's available to us? Well, go into a courtroom and listen to the arguments. Some of them will be scientific testimony, ballistics, psychological testimony, and laypersons are supposed to sit there and make sense of it. And I've always thought this was one of the real paradoxes of our current practices that if you're sitting on a jury and the expert from Harvard comes in and argues one side, and the expert from Yale comes in and argues just the opposite, and they're both experts, what position does that leave us in? How are we to trump the experts and say which is right and which is wrong? What it means is that it comes back to the rhetorical situation of audiences being persuaded. Why did one expert persuade more than the other did? And that's not to be facile or dismissive about science. It's to say when science comes into contact with the context of judgment, that rhetoric matters. So I don't see Rhetoric of Science as being in any sense a kind of separatist movement or anything like that. I think it's just a logical place for rhetorical studies to go. It's not the only focus for rhetoric, politics, of course, but even now, I mean, how much of our politics has to do with the rhetoric of science? As I say, ask yourself about climate change. Does one's position on that have anything to do with politics? The question answers itself.
So if you'll allow me to play John Brockman to your Dawkins, what do you see as your biggest contribution to Rhetoric of Science?
Besides Lisa Karanen? Well, I don't know. I played an institutional role, I guess, that helped kind of keep the project moving along. I was an advocate for, fairly early on for the aggressive study of Rhetoric of Science. And I guess to this point, still one of the few in the field who has actually written collaboratively with a scientist, a biologist. I think that's a pretty good model. It's very difficult to do, though, because it's hard to find somebody who does biology or physics who wants to, sort of start talking about rhetoric. They take a certain risk among their colleagues for doing that, and many of them who are trained in science don't quite see the point. I was lucky that I did. So I think that was something of importance. And beyond that, I don't know. I don't think I should be the one to judge it.